Bom dia a todos e a todas. Estamos muito felizes aqui para receber esse evento, né, do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ecologia, da UFPR. Hoje a gente vai ter, então, uma palestra bastante interessante sobre ciência de modo geral. E a partir de agora eu vou falar inglês, também nosso convidado é escocês, né, para ele entender a apresentação que nós vamos fazer a respeito dele. Mas, ao final, vocês podem usar o chat para fazer perguntas em português. Nós vamos fazer as transcrições que forem necessárias, tá? Então, seria interessante todo mundo participar bastante. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all attending this webinar. I'm Rosana Rocha, coordinator of the Graduate Program in Ecology and Conservation at Universidade Federal do Paraná. And I'm happy to host this event and the opportunity to start a healthy discussion about how science and scientists are prone to errors and flaws and what we can do to make science more trustworthy. Here with me are Dr. James Roper, a collaborator in our program, and also two PhD candidates, Elena and Rafael, who will help in the discussion. Our guest today is Dr. Stuart Ritchie, a psychologist in the Department of Social Genetics and Development Psychiatry with King's College in London. First, in his publications, you can see that Dr. Ritchie is interested in the genetics and aging of intelligence and brain networks. Dr. Ritchie is also a science communicator, writing for newspapers and blogs, and his first book was published in 2016. Is entitled Intelligence, All That Matters. Very recently, in July this year, he published a second book called Science Fiction. Are human beings and are subject to very human flaws. This book calls Elena's attention, our PhD student, and she used her own initiative to invite Dr. Ritchie to give us this talk. And he was very kind to immediately accept this invitation. So we are grateful to have you, Dr. Ritchie, to present this talk. And I will pass on the microphone. And as I told you before, we will have time for discussion. So you can profit of the chat of YouTube to make your questions that we're going to ask after the talk. Go ahead, Dr. Ritchie, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the lovely introduction. So hopefully everyone can see my my slides now. So I'm going to talk to you about the replication crisis and some cautionary tales from the replication crisis. So as you've just heard, I'm a psychologist by training. And I have been involved in this question of the replication crisis right back from when I did my PhD about 10 years ago. Well, I'll talk to you about exactly that in just a moment. So I'm going to talk about the replication crisis, what it is. Then I'm going to talk about why there's a replication crisis. And I'm going to talk about the 4 problems that I think we have in science, which are in the subtitle of my my most recent book, which are fraud, bias, negligence, and hype. And then I'm going to ask what we can do about all this, what we can do to change it, and I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on that as well. So in 2011, as I said, I was doing my PhD back then. This paper came out, and this is a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is a very prestigious and respected journal in the world of psychology research. You know, you'd be very happy to get a paper published in this journal. It's a good place to be. And this presented 9 experiments, all of which seem to show that the undergraduate students at Cornell University that the professor, Daryl Bem, was testing had psychic powers. They were able to use psychic abilities to see into the future using, you know, just their minds. The experiments are quite complicated. I won't go into the details of them, but the conclusion of this paper was that the students could see things which they could not possibly have known about previously and could predict for instance, which words and which pictures are going to appear in the future. And actually, if the results of this paper are true, then physics is completely wrong. It's not just psychology. Physics is wrong. Everything's wrong. We have to throw everything out because people have extrasensory perception, psychic powers, premonition. And what I thought back in 2011 was that I would try and run the same experiments again. The author of the paper, Daryl Bem, put up the software that you would require to run the experiments again on his website. And so I thought, well, I'm going to collect some participants and run the same thing again, because wouldn't it be amazing if we found evidence for psychic powers as well? So me and a couple of my colleagues ran the same experiments again, seeing if people could predict words that they were about to see in the future using psychic abilities. And we found absolutely nothing. So we found no effects of psychic powers. People were just acting as if you would expect, if they were guessing. And so it didn't seem in our replication study that there were any psychic effects. And we sent that off to the same journal. We sent it to the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And this is the response that we immediately got from the reviewer when we submitted our paper. Dear Dr. Ritchie, well, I wasn't a doctor back then, but it was very nice to be called that in an email. I've read your paper, blah, blah, blah. The basic issue is this. This journal does not publish replication studies, whether successful or unsuccessful. Instead, we seek to publish papers that make a substantive, novel theoretical contribution. Now, that was the response to the journal, and we felt quite aggrieved by that, because in a world where lots and lots of experiments are happening, you do expect to see some of them come up with null results. And if the journals are just focusing on the exciting, new, novel theoretical contributions, even if they say something quite silly like psychic abilities exist, and if they're not focusing on publishing any replication studies, then it does give a biased picture of the science. And this, I thought, was a really nice illustration of this problem in science. And around about that same time, we did eventually publish the paper, by the way, in another journal. Around about that same time, in 2011, there was a story breaking in the Netherlands that concerned this guy. This is Diederik Stapel, who was a social psychology professor at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And he had papers published in some of the world's best journals, including Science, so not just psychology journals, but science journals, really important science journals. And he, it turned out, to cut a long story short, it turned out that he had been making up his results. He was a fraud who had entirely fabricated the experiments. He never actually did any of the experiments. And he actually sat with an open Excel spreadsheet and typed in the numbers that he wanted for his analysis to come out the way that he wanted, and then he would send it off to a journal, and it would often get published. And these were also headline-grabbing studies about things like the messiness of the environment that you're in can make you more racist. All this kind of stuff that can easily be translated to a clickable article and so on. And so in 2011, this was discovered, and his articles started getting retracted from the journals. And so this is the one from Science, fabrication of data. You can see it was retracted. So this happened, and also the Daryl Bem story, and also a few other things. And it started to get to the case where psychologists realized that they couldn't really trust what was published in the psychology literature. And over the next couple of years after that, they started to band together to try and really assess the replicability of the psychological literature. And this is just one of the papers. The graphs I'm going to show you, I can send you these slides afterwards. I can make them available so you can dig into them, and the references are there. I've not really got enough time to go into all the details of all the graphs I'm going to show you, but the point of this one is that they took a selection of studies that had been published in the psychology literature and tried to replicate them in independent labs. And of course, that's the cornerstone of science, right? If you can't get the same results in an independent experiment, then it raises questions about the validity of that original study. And over a lot of these experiments, so the one that's described here, and also several others, they broadly found that around about 50% of the findings in the psychological literature were not easily replicable by independent researchers. So, and even when they could be replicated, the effect sizes in the replication studies were much smaller than the original studies. So in some cases, the original studies had come up with effects that didn't seem to exist. And in other cases, they'd come up with effects that were much bigger than they really should have been. And so this happened. There were lots of papers that came out that were assessing different aspects of this replication thing. And the story spread beyond psychology and into other subjects too. So here's a news article saying that the replication crisis has engulfed economics. Here's one saying that it's that artificial intelligence has got a similar problem. Here's one about preclinical cancer research. And in this case, it was particularly sad because there were 50 papers that they identified to try to replicate. And in not a single case could the replicators actually even begin to replicate the experiments because there weren't enough details in the method sections of the papers for them to even begin to replicate them. And when eventually they got to replicate them, which they could only do for 18 studies, within those 18, only a fraction were actually replicable as well. So there were other issues that were raised by that story. And then there's also this book, which explains that cancer stuff was preclinical. This paper talks about treatments. So it's called Ending Medical Reversal by Vinay Prasad and Adam Sifu. And it talks about doctors that are giving treatments that, a large scale, high quality randomized trial comes along and fails to find evidence for that treatment. And in fact, reverses the entire medical consensus. So it's like the replication crisis is happening within medicine. So that's a recommended read as well, and quite a scary one. And if you ask scientists, this is a survey that was done in Nature, not a representative survey, so buyer beware, but it's a survey of scientists, and 52% of them said that they think there was a significant crisis of reproducibility, and 38% said, and it's a bit of a strange phrase, but 38% said that there was a slight crisis. And only 3% said there was no problem. And in fact, you see a similar picture if you look at the publications in the literature that mention this crisis idea, that there's a crisis in science. And you can see these are all the published papers, not just in psychology, but in general. And you can see in the last few years, there's been this upsurge in papers discussing the replication crisis, most of which say, yes, we think there is a replication crisis, and only a small portion of which say that there isn't one and question the idea of it. And, there are people who would push back against some of the stuff I'm going to say in this talk, so you should be aware of that as well. I think they're wrong for various reasons, but there is a debate on this. So why are these studies not replicable? Why is it that that so often we go out and try and do an experiment the same way as it was described in the scientific literature, and we don't find that it is replicable? Well, the first of the examples I give in my the first of the reasons I give is fraud. This is Yoshitaka Fuji, who is currently, as we speak, this could change at any moment, but currently he has the most retractions of any scientist in history, right? So more papers retracted than anyone else from the scientific literature for fraud. He is an anesthesiologist who invented lots of anesthesiology trials that never existed, and he's had a really amazing number of papers retracted from the literature. And he is actually at the top of this Retraction Watch leaderboard. So there's a website called Retraction Watch that rates retractions and does a little bit of digging into why each article is retracted, taken out of the literature. And you can see here that there's Yoshitaka Fuji at the top with his 183 retractions. Diederik Stapel, who I mentioned before, the social psychology professor from the Netherlands that I mentioned, he's at number 5 with 58 papers retracted from the literature. And you can see there's a wide range of different subjects in there as well, condensed matter physics, oncology, crystallography, with scientists who have really had quite an amazing number of papers retracted. And these are all frauds, by the way. They're not due to honest mistakes, honest errors. These are fraudulent. So this is like the kind of reverse Nobel Prize for scientists. You know, you do not want to be on this list. And you can look at it. I really do recommend taking a look at retractionwatch.com, which is a fantastic website. One of the ways, so it's, you know, Diederik Stapel we saw made up his data, you know, typed it into an Excel spreadsheet. But another way that fraud often occurs, and this is just for kind of just to give a nice illustration, is in diagrams, is in the actual the photography from, you know, Western blots or microscope images that scientists include in their papers. So you can see here that this is a Western blot, you know, so it's trying to find out which proteins are in a particular substance that you're looking at, a particular sample. And kind of the first time you look at it, it seems fairly straightforward. It seems like they're just all kind of random shapes and there's nothing particularly interesting about this. But if you look at it in more detail, it turns out that these have actually been duplicated. This comes from a real paper, by the way. There's a figure in a paper. When you add the little colored dots, it becomes clear that these have been photoshopped. These have been duplicated. Some of them have been like stretched out a little bit or pulled out to look a little bit different, but they are the same shapes over and over again. And this is a very common way that scientists commit fraud in articles. They try and make their study look nicer than it really is by photoshopping the pictures, essentially. And this happens quite a lot. This is an investigation by Elizabeth Dick, who found that in some cases, in some years, around about 5% of articles that she surveyed had some kind of strange anomaly in their pictures, whether it was a duplication or some kind of other kind of photoshopping. And, you know, only a small proportion of them are frauds, but still quite a lot of them are. And this is one way that fraud often happens. And often it can be staring people in the face. I mean, these are all papers that had been peer reviewed, but the peer reviewers did not notice that they had some kind of fraudulent picture. And, you know, but as I just said, you know, fraud is a small number. I think if you ask scientists, have you ever committed fraud? 2% of them say that they have. So, you know, that's likely an underestimate, but it's a small number. If you ask them, do you know anyone who's committed fraud? I think the answer is about 14% of them say that they know someone who's committed fraud. But that's still a minority, right? It's probably not the case that the replication crisis is caused by fraud, even if fraud is more common than we would like to think. So we have to look at other reasons. But it's funny because the scientific literature kind of looks as if scientists have manipulated the data and made it, chosen what the results should be for themselves. Because if you look across studies, as in this graph, that report a positive result, i.e. that report support for the hypothesis that scientists had, the majority of them do. Now, you wouldn't necessarily expect only 50-50 results here, right? You wouldn't expect a paper to be a toss-up whether it supports a hypothesis or not, because a hypothesis is an educated guess. People are gonna are gonna have lots of background knowledge into what their hypothesis should be. But you wouldn't also expect it, like in my field, psychiatry, psychology, which is down at the bottom here, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be the case that 90%, over 90% of articles have a positive result. I know a lot of you are from ecology. You can see that it's over something over 75%, I think, for ecology, or just under 75%. Sorry, for ecology. And one of the reasons for this is that the decision to publish articles is made not on the basis of whether the experiment is robust, whether the study design looks good, whether it's a high quality study. It's made on the basis of the results, and people are much more likely to publish articles that have positive results, and they're much more likely to even send them off to journals in the first place if they have positive results. We saw that in our experience at the very start when the journal said, well, we're interested in new exciting stuff and not really the replication studies. And this just is one example. Again, I don't want to spend time going into all the details, but this is just one example of where an original literature, I don't know if you're familiar with these funnel plots, but the idea is that each dot on this is a study, from a previous literature. So this is like in a meta-analysis. And you can see that the original studies all had kind of quite large effect sizes. They were a nice, robust effects that showed that something was going on. But when people came along to do replication studies, which they pre-registered and said, we will publish these no matter whether the outcome is positive or negative, actually all the replications clustered around an effect size of 0 and were not statistically significant. And that's just in one literature. I'm just using this as an example, but the point is that there is publication bias in the literature. We're more likely to have positive findings, and we'll come back to that. But it's not just publication bias, because we all want to publish papers, right? There's a huge push and incentive for us to publish articles and make our CVs longer and get our names in print and so on. So instead of just putting a null finding in the file drawer, there are subtler ways that scientists can change a result that looks as if it's non-significant or null into a statistically significant result that they can publish. Here's an example. This is a paper which I don't know if you've seen the TED Talk. There are millions and millions of views. It's the second most watched TED Talk of all time, I think, by Amy Cuddy on power posing. And this was a paper that was published in the journal Psychological Science. And the idea is that if you do a power pose like this, maybe before a stressful event like an interview or something like that, you will have raised testosterone, your stress hormones will go down, you'll feel more powerful, you'll take more risks, be more tolerant of taking more risks. And the only problem is that this paper failed to replicate when an independent lab came along to try to test it. And the really interesting thing in this case is that, the middle author there, Amy Cuddy, that's her there in the picture, she did the TED Talks, but the original author, Dana Carney, who was the first author of the paper, has actually come out since and written this amazing letter on her website where she says, as the evidence has come in, my views have updated, and as such, I do not believe that power pose effects are real. And then she described aspects of the study that made her realize that actually what they were doing was pushing themselves towards a positive result, even if it was a false positive. So she said, first of all, the sample size of the study was tiny. There were only 42 participants in the study. Initially, they were interested just in risk taking, but they looked at several other things, and they turned out to be significant, and they were published as well. They checked the significance of the effect along the way. So they ran 25 people, checked the significance. Then they thought, oh, well, we'll do another few, 10, check the significance. We'll do another few, 7, check the significance, then 5, then check the significance. And at that point, they published. And of course, the more times you're running the statistical tests, the more likely you are to find a fluke, a false positive result. And that's, you're kind of asking for that to happen if you do it this way. They excluded participants from the experiment who didn't follow the directions, but didn't report this in the paper. They ran several statistical tests and then just used the one that had the lowest p-value, the lowest significance value. They dropped the outliers from some of the analyses, but not all of them, so they were inconsistent. And they asked lots and lots of questions and then just reported the ones that gave positive results. So you can see if you add all this up, it's not really a surprise that the effect in the paper was not replicable, even though it had been spread by this point to tens of millions of people who had watched the TED Talk. And these are examples of what have become known as questionable research practices, or QRPs. So one of them is p-hacking, trying to get that p-value below 0.05 by including or excluding people from the experiment, changing the data in various ways after you've seen the results. Failing to report the non-significant results. So this is like publication bias on the level of a single paper. So, you're just choosing to report the ones that worked, which again is going to increase your chance of finding a false positive result, because you're not reporting all the null results as well. Optional stopping, so not having a plan for how many subjects you're going to recruit or how many tests you're going to do before you do them. Again, as I explained, that's going to increase your false positive rate. And also this thing, harking or hypothesizing after the results are known. So you kind of look at the results and then say, well, actually, yeah, I did think that might happen. And then you sort of convince yourself that you had hypothesized these results, even though you didn't really. And if you ask scientists and statisticians across different fields, you find that they're doing these things all the time, right? So in psychologists, large proportions of them say that they have, done things that would increase the false positive rate of their studies. So collecting more data after they run their analysis, peeking at their results, and then taking out the data points that were a bit inconvenient, for instance. Quite large proportions of them say that. Economists agree that they've presented findings selectively to confirm an argument. Biomedical statisticians have been, report being asked by those who are employing them to interpret the statistics on the basis of expectations and stress only significant and not non-significant findings. So you can see this is happening quite a lot, and you just ask scientists and they say, yeah, this is how we do it. So that's bias. We've had fraud, we've had bias. Now I just want to mention negligence. So this is a graph from a paper that reported this algorithm that went through scientific papers published in the literature and checked whether they had inconsistent numbers. So check whether the numbers that they reported were actually possible. That is, if you report there are certain statistics that are a bit like the three sides of a triangle, right? If you report two of them, the third one can only be a certain way. And if you report that third value as being something completely different, then something must have gone wrong. So it's a bit like that in the case of the p-values that they looked at in this stat check algorithm. And it turned out that in some cases, close to 60% of papers had some kind of inconsistency, some kind of problem with their statistics. In some journals, this is again in psychology, but I have no reason to think it would be different in different fields. A smaller proportion, but still a scary proportion of results, somewhere between 6.5% and 15.8% of results were grossly inconsistent. That is, they had the chance of flipping the results of the entire experiment around and making a non-significant result into a significant one, or vice versa. So this is quite scary. The overall impression that you get when you read this paper is that the scientific literature is just riddled with mistakes, errors, and some of these might be due to fraud and so on, but probably the vast majority are just due to things like typos, errors, copy and paste mistakes, and all that kind of thing. If you don't want to commit fraud and you've tried p-hacking your result and you can't get it below 0.05, and you definitely know it isn't a mistake, then you can just spin it. You can just do what a lot of scientists do, which is when they find a result that's not statistically significant, they can simply write it up verbally as if it was statistically significant. So this is a selection of examples from previous scientific papers. These are all real things which scientists have said to kind of spin their way out of having found a non-significant result. So a trend that approached significance is one thing. That was for a p-value of reported as less than 0.06. A trend significance level, so that's a p-value of 0.08. Again, you want to get lower than 0.05. So, the idea here is that somehow it's trending towards being a positive result, even though it wasn't a positive result in the paper. Narrowly eluded statistical significance. It barely escapes statistical significance. Fairly significant. Significantly significant. Hovering close to significance. All but significant, approaching marginal significance, very closely brushed the limit of statistical significance. And my favorite one, my personal favorite, which is not absolutely significant, but very probably so, which I think is a great, just bizarre use of language. But these are all clearly scientists who are essentially revealing through their language that they really, really want their finding to be statistically significant, even though the numbers show that it is not. And this spin isn't just in the scientific papers themselves, of course. It's also when you write your press release, to press release your paper. And I don't know, many of you may well have done this, but the university press office will often, write a press release for a paper. But it's actually also the case that scientists themselves write press releases. Scientists themselves are often to blame for misleading press releases. And this is a study from 2014 that looked at exaggeration in press releases, different kinds of exaggeration. So making causal claims from correlational data, giving advice when you couldn't really, about diet or lifestyle, when actually that wasn't really what was looked at in the paper. Or making an inference from a study on, for example, on mice, and saying this affects humans, when actually, it hadn't been tested in humans. And what they showed in this paper was that when press releases were exaggerated, i.e. when press releases had this, made these mistakes, made these errors, it was much more likely that the news articles that were based on would also have those errors. And when the press releases didn't have those errors, it was much less likely that the news articles that people would read would have these kind of mistakes. And so this provides evidence that it's the scientists' fault themselves, right? The scientists, the people who are writing the press release, not the journalists who are misrepresenting stuff. It's us. It's us that's misrepresenting the conclusions that we can draw from our research. And I think in many cases, this happens in books as well. So these are three that I mentioned in my own book. These are three books where scientists at very prestigious universities, all of these are from the United States, and you can tell that they're very clever because they have PhD on the cover of each of the books. And they, I would argue, it's not that this is fraudulent research or it's made up, or even that it's completely wrong. But what they're doing is, in all of these cases, and I can explain in more detail, but in all these cases, they're exaggerating from data that shows, maybe something interesting, to this will change your life. This explains everything about human, behavior and so on. So they're going way beyond the data. And the problem is, of course, you won't get a best-selling book if you don't go way beyond the data, right? In most cases. So just to sum up everything that I've mentioned so far, this is a study, and one of the more shocking studies, I think, that really summed this up. So each dot here is a trial of an antidepressant drug, and in the left column A there, you can see that these were the studies that were registered. So these are the studies that in a database, a government database, where you have to say, that I'm doing a study on antidepressants and depression levels. About 50% of the studies that were registered, that's the red ones, had null results, right? They found no effect of the depression drug. And around about 50% of them had positive results, so they found an effect. By the time those studies actually got published in the literature, though, in the scientific literature, so became journal articles, almost all of the positive results managed to find a journal to be published in, and all but one were eventually published in a journal. But half of the negative results, the null results, didn't get published. They ended up just in the file drawer, didn't see the literature at all. However, it gets worse than that, because if you read those papers, you find that in many of the cases where it was originally a negative trial, the authors had swapped the outcome and actually pretended that they were always looking at a different outcome. So reported, maybe they were looking at scores on this particular depression questionnaire. They didn't find it was significant, so they switched to look at a different depression questionnaire and found that was significant, and so only published that one. So you'll see again, what used to be negative results had actually turned into positive ones. And then if you move on to D, within the studies that did actually have negative results, they were written up just verbally, like we've seen, as if they were, much more promising. They were spun to make them look much more promising than they really were. And then the final column there is just to add insult to injury, that the positive studies were cited much more often than the negative ones as well. And I think when you put that all together, it's really a depressing, even though it's quite nice, has nice colors, it's quite a depressing look at the scientific literature, because what it essentially shows us is that what we see when we go and read the scientific literature is not at all an accurate representation of what science has actually been done. So the question is, what can we do about all this? And again, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about it, especially within your own research areas. But I think, one of the things that I've previously mentioned it in the talk. One of the things that really that is really problematic is the structure, the system in which we do science. So my friend Zach Weinersmith made this comic when my book came out. It's kind of a comic companion to the book. It's a big long comic. These are just a couple of the panels from it. But what I'm arguing here, and this is supposed to be me, what I'm arguing here is that science is probably the best thing that we've ever invented in terms of improving the world, helping us develop technologies, cure diseases, and so on. But academia, the university system, is not. The university system pushes scientists towards ever more publications, constantly publishing articles. It pushes them towards constantly going for grants, hyping up what they've actually found beyond what the evidence can show. And I think it's not a system that encourages us to do good science. It's a system that encourages us to just follow its rules, follow the particular incentives, which produce lots and lots of scientific papers and produce lots of nice jobs for people like us, but don't actually do what science is supposed to be doing, which is discovering, true things, reliable things about the world. And one of the things that the system certainly doesn't encourage is publishing replication studies. So to go right back to the very start, we tried to publish our replication study, and we were told by the journal, we're not interested ever in publishing replication studies. So what can we do? Well, one thing is we can change the journals, right? We can get journals to sign up to new ways of publishing articles and new aspects of study write-ups that can improve the openness and the transparency of articles. So this is part of the open science movement, right? It's getting journals to be more open and force the authors who are publishing papers in those journals to be more open with their research as well. So these are just a few ideas: being more transparent about your code that you're using to analyze your data, sharing your data online. If you've got nothing to hide, you should share your data. Being more transparent about your the particular materials you've used, encouraging publication of replications, as we've just been talking about, and pre-registration. And that's something to go into a little bit more detail. Some journals are now offering what is called a registered report, which is an entirely new way of publishing science. So the old way is that you run your experiment, you write it up, and then you submit it to a journal, right? The standard way. But in this way, in the registered report, what you do instead is you write your introduction section and your method section, right? So the plan for doing your study, and you submit it to the journal at that point. The journal then gets it peer reviewed. So the peer reviewers check if they agree that your study is a good design, is high quality, is going to answer the question that you want to answer, and so on. And then the journal says, if the peer reviewers are satisfied, the journal says, we will publish this article whether or not the results are positive. Whether they're positive, negative, ambiguous, we'll publish it. You then go off and collect your data, do your experiment, write it up. It then gets reviewed again to check that you actually did what you said you would do, and then it gets published. And as you've probably already noticed, this kills publication bias, right? You're no longer judging articles on their results, which is a really bad thing to do. You're judging them on the quality of their design. And it's such a great way to do things. So I do encourage you to look this up, this registered report format, and see if the journals in your own field are offering this. And maybe if you know a journal editor, then you can maybe talk to them about offering this particular way of publishing articles, because I really do think that it makes results much more reliable. And this is not to say that you shouldn't explore data as well. It's just that should be separate from the process of hypotheses that you make beforehand and write down. And all the stuff about the design is published publicly as well, so anyone can check. And it turns out, I'm just going to skip this one just for time, but it turns out that when you do these registered reports, the number of positive results, which we know in psychology is very, very high. If you think back to that graph I showed you near the start, we're over 90% positive results in psychology from the normal papers, the usual, write your paper, do your study, write your paper, send it to journals. In those cases, 90-something% of papers report a positive result. But when you have to actually get your methods all checked out, you have to agree, then the journal agrees to publish no matter which way you go, the positive percentage of results drops down to 44% or something around about that number. And so this should tell us a lot, because what it's saying is when scientists don't have any opportunities to just mess around with the data and do all those questionable research practices that I described, they get much fewer positive results, right? So I think that should tell you something about the way that we do research. I think this is a really stunning graph, actually. And some journals are now offering badges for papers that are open and transparent. The technology is better nowadays for you to do all this stuff. The Open Science Framework, for instance, is a website where you can upload your plans, you can upload your materials, you can upload your results when you've got them, your spreadsheets of results. And again, just to make the whole process completely transparent and show people what you've been doing, rather than what happens right now, which is, there's loads of stuff all hidden, and then suddenly it all appears in a paper, and we don't know whether that paper really reflects the reality of what went on in the study. So it's much easier to make things open and transparent. And in fact, it's good for you as well. Working in this open way, sharing your data and so on. I won't go through this in detail because I do want to have plenty of time for questions. But it's worth reading this article by Florian Markowitz in Genome Biology, because he's essentially saying it's not just good for science if you're open and transparent and share everything. It's good for you personally as well. It gives you a reputation as someone who's honest. It helps you convince reviewers. It helps you avoid making terrible mistakes in your research, because other people can check what you're doing. And of course, science is all about that, right? Science is all about other people checking, having a discussion about and a debate about evidence. So it's to the greatest extent that we can encourage that, the better. And there are lots of different organizations happening. Obviously, in the last year or so, they've been online, but in previous years, they've been conferences that you can go to in person. I know in psychology, we've got this thing, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, where we meet up and talk about new reforms that could be made, new ways to change journals, new ways to change universities. Talking of which, in the UK, we have this thing, the UK Reproducibility Network, where universities are banding together or to have these reproducibility representatives within departments. And they're trying to push universities to change the way they hire scientists as well. So not just hiring scientists on the basis of a big, long CV, but hiring them on the basis of how open and transparent they are, how much of a good scientific citizen they are, sharing data, helping people develop tools, and so on. Things which, at the moment, are not particularly well rewarded in hiring, tenure, promotion, and so on in science. There are initiatives to have, journal clubs where you talk about the reproducibility of your work, where you have a cup of tea. So this thing that's spreading all around the world now. And there are various other initiatives, but there are all these kind of bottom up and top down changes that are happening right now that do make me somewhat optimistic that we can, now that we know about it, we can change all these problems in science. And in fact, I think one of the most important things that we can be doing is asking these so-called meta-scientific questions, right? Asking about the replication crisis, discussing it, talking about these problems. And that's why I wrote this book, to have this discussion, to say to people, look, scientists are human. They're open to biases, making mistakes, and in some cases, deliberately, fraudulently making up data. We're not so aware of it, or we're less aware of it than we should be. So just simply having this discussion. So that's why, I really, again, thank you for inviting me along to talk about this. I'd love to hear any questions. Feel free to get in touch if you want to hear any more. And I'm also happy to share these slides with anyone who asks as well. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions now.
So thank you very much for your talk. It was
Thanks.
Brilliant, as your book. And yes, you touched many important points. And by the chat, we're seeing that many people are thinking, oh my God, what's going on? So many medical research doing some fraud or mistakes or bias. People, we do not really think all about it. And I read in your book, you said that we scientists are kind of trusting people, that we trust each other, and we always think that we are doing our best.
Yes. And
sometimes we're not. So it's very interesting to get this conversation.
Yeah, I think in many cases, you have scientists who work with each other, and they're very happily, working together and so on. And you hear these terrible stories of someone saying, my colleague that I worked with for years, it turns out is a fraud and has been making up the data and so on. And these are rare cases, but I think they do illustrate that we just need to be open to questioning each other a lot more.
So you're talking about my colleague, and many scientists, now we have many collaborative research. So you're being pushed to that. So do you think that even though we know that some co-authors sometimes cheat each other, but this kind of science that's more collaborative is better for having a more transparent science?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think here's a case where there's a recent story that I think illustrates this quite nicely about COVID-19. So you saw all the stuff with hydroxychloroquine, the huge debate around that, lots of endless debates around that. There were papers published in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, so two supposedly the best medical journals in the world, on that topic, by researchers at Harvard University, and they said hydroxychloroquine is actually dangerous. It might increase the death rate. So you may have seen those papers. It turned out that the Harvard researchers had never even looked at the data. Right? They had got this data from this collaborator they had working for this company called Surgisphere. He had just given them all these data, and they never thought to check it. They never looked at it. They had complete 100% trust in the data that they had been given, and it turned out that the data were really flawed. It's unclear whether they were fraudulent or just wrong, just mistaken in various ways, and they had to retract those papers within 2 weeks. Those papers got retracted from the Lancet and the New England Journal, and I think that's a great example of where you don't have to suspect your collaborators of being fraudulent. They would have had a great opportunity there because, they'd be working with this company who'd been giving them the data, would have been a great data set if it was real. And I think that would be, brilliant for science to collaborate more in that way. But all they should have done was say, can you send us the data so we can have a look at it? Can we have a little look at it? it amazes me that they never asked that question, and they ended up, quite embarrassed at the end of it. So I think we just have to have this norm, this culture where we're always just open to share stuff. Yeah, sure, I'll send you my code. Yeah, sure, I'll send you my my data. Feel free to have a look at it. It's not that we should feel awkward about asking that and feel awkward about saying to people, is there any chance I could check your code? I don't want to offend you. And we shouldn't, feel offended when people say, can I check?
Okay. So, Elena, do you like to ask a question for Dr. Ritchie before you pass to the chat?
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Professor. It's really nice also to see in the presentation, and I encourage everyone to read the book. It's really, really great, and it's
thank you.
Go easy. It's easygoing. Sorry, the opposite is really easygoing. It's so simple to read. And one thing is that I think is relevant to us to discuss the future in terms of what kind of scientists we want to be and we want to have in the future. So, for example, we are discussing in our graduate program the possible merging with the other graduate program to conform a new graduate program. So what kind of profile, what kind of scientists should we be making or producing to overcome these problems? So
yeah, it's a great question. I think to some extent we're something which I think is less commonly discussed is almost like a sort of selection effect in science, where people get quite frustrated, I think, if they get all this pressure to publish constantly, and they get all this pressure to come up with new results and so on. And if you're super you have super high levels of integrity, and you don't want to do that, and you don't want to publish stuff, I think I certainly have heard many cases, and there is some research. I certainly have heard many cases of people saying, well, I just give up. I'm going to go and do something else in my life now because I don't think science is the thing. So I think we need to encourage a culture where, again, it's not so much about constantly publishing papers. It's about making a contribution, and we should be much more diverse in our understanding of what a contribution to science can look like. So instead of a paper with your first, you're the first author on it, a contribution to science could be producing a new tool that helps people be more open with their research. It could be peer reviewing research for other people. It could be writing explanations of science for people in different fields. All sorts of things like that could be rewarded much more than currently what's being rewarded, which is, of course, papers being published. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I'm not exaggerating that much. Yeah. There are those really are the incentives. So I think telling people that the kind of scientist we want is someone who is willing to make a contribution, and making sure that is rewarded, because if you don't reward it, then you can't expect the other people to stay around for too long.
All right. Before we start with the other questions, I have one more question for Andre.
Sure.
I will read it. So, ecology is a scientific field with many complementary explanations of a same pattern, likely given the complexity of nature that generates many context dependency situations. In these cases, it's very difficult to replicate one observational study. For instance, if space and time of observations differ, local context dependencies and evolution make exactly replications impossible. So showing our raw data, not only our methodological details, is now considered as a whole grail for the reliability of ecological studies. Many ecological journals are now asking raw data as an effort for a more open science. However, I have a suspicion that this may disguise the concern for making or manipulating data to tell a beautiful ecological history. This can be indeed an issue in our scientific field. How can we ecologists cope with this?
Well, yeah, so there's a lot there. I think the first part is absolutely right, in that there are types of studies that you're never going to replicate. So, for instance, a study that I worked on myself is this really unique data set that we have in Scotland, where people were followed up starting in 1947. and they were followed up over time, and they're now in their 80s, and we've been following them up for years and years and years. It's next to impossible to do that study again, right? It is impossible to do that study again. You're never going to be able to find, without a time machine, you're never going to be able to do that again. But the broad principles from the study can certainly be replicated in different contexts. And in fact, my argument would be that if you can't find, if your result is only applicable in one particular context under very, very specific conditions, then maybe it's not that interesting a scientific finding, or it's certainly not something which you can generalize. It certainly would be interesting to write about it and tell people about it, but then it depends on how much generalizing you do. And we're encouraged, I think, to, when we're writing a scientific paper, to write it up as if we've discovered a new law of the universe or something, rather than saying, well, in this specific context, at this specific time, under these specific atmospheric conditions or whatever it is, we found this result. Feel free to use this in whatever way you want. So I think, and also I think triangulation is important as well. So doing exact replications of studies is all very well, and making sure that you can get the same effect in different labs, if it's possible, is one thing. But also doing lots of different types of studies that all kind of point in the same direction, or test a particular hypothesis from different perspectives and triangulate it, is also really important. So I think that's almost the next step. Once you get beyond a lot of these problems of research manipulation, data manipulation, and questionable research practices and so on, sort of the next step is to think about triangulating research, and that's sort of gets into kind of interesting philosophical science issues. I've sort of now talked for so long that I've lost the last part of the question, but did that sort of answer it?
Yes, I guess.
Yeah, thanks.
part of it at least.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so let's take now a few questions from the chat. The chat is just crazy doing questions, and then
oh, wow, yeah.
If you want to do some questions. So the first one is from Alessandro. How can we lead with replicability in the field of social sciences where we cannot replicate the study?
Yeah, so in cases where the study can't directly be replicated, I think there are other things that can be done to increase the reliability or the credibility of the findings. And I think, being completely writing the paper in such a way that's totally transparent is really important. So, a lot of us are doing exploratory research, right? We're collecting a data set, and then we're kind of exploring it and seeing what can be found in it, running lots of different statistics, and then sort of publishing, the most interesting things that we find. But we're writing it up. So that's exploratory research, but we're writing it up as if it was confirmatory research, as if it was testing hypotheses that we had already thought of, months in advance or whatever. So I think, but I think there's nothing wrong with exploratory research, and I think it's completely fine to write up a paper that completely goes through, that says from the start, we thought of these hypotheses, and then we thought of some other stuff afterwards, and this is the exploratory section of the paper. So what I want to see in papers is a much more honest description of what was done in the study. So that's one thing. When I read a paper, it jumps out to me that often the story looks a little bit too perfect for what I know. I know myself how messy the process of doing a scientific study is, right? So I want to see that messiness in the paper is one thing. But I think also sharing data, I think also sharing code, having things like pre-registering an analysis somewhere publicly, even if you're not doing the whole registered reports thing that I described in the talk. Just writing down your analysis plan somewhere publicly and saying we're going to generally stick to this, and if we don't stick to this, we'll say that we've deviated from it. Also another good thing. Having your colleagues have a system where your colleagues are checking your code and rerunning things for you. So this being called a co-pilot system, where you get someone else to run your code and make sure it works. All these kind of things you can put in your paper to make the results more credible, in my view, even if it's not the case that someone can immediately go away and do exactly the same study again because maybe your data set was particularly unique in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next question by Marco Rangi. How about reports of a single rare specimen of a species that could not be verified?
Well, that's a great question. I think, and it illustrates really nicely that some of the things we've learned in psychology don't necessarily apply to other subjects. But I think, again, the answer really is openness and transparency all the way, right? Being completely clear about what's been found, documenting all the data, and not just trying to make it look as if it was was this perfect clear story where you went and discovered this new species or whatever it is. So I'm kind of slightly struggling to answer that because it's a situation that's so far removed from my own kind of research, and it's not really something that I've considered. But I think, just pushing this idea of being completely open and making sure that someone else, even if they can't come along and verify the new species, they can certainly verify the data and the stuff that you have published alongside it.
Okay. So you have described problems in social and medical sciences, but you did not mention ecology papers. Is this particularly good news for us ecologists, or is it just an understanding?
It's a good question. I have actually seen several papers now in ecology that I don't think they're quite at doing the same kind of thing as in psychology, where they pick 50 experiments from the literature and try and replicate them in subsequent papers. But they do things like checking the statistical power of the studies and finding it's actually quite low. Checking the reproducibility. So there's this distinction between reproducibility on the one hand, which is when you ask, can I get the same results from someone else's same data set, right? It's not that I'm replicated it with a new data set. It's that I'm trying to get their code to work on their data and get the same results that they publish in their paper. So I have seen reproducibility stuff in ecology, and it seems to be problematic. And I think so. This is a question where we have to go back to think about the history of the replication crisis, because it started in psychology. I think there were some reasons for that, which is psychology is a subject where it's very easy, for instance, to hype up results, make them seem more interesting to the general public, because of course we're all human beings and we all are interested in how the human mind works and so on. So I think there's reasons why that would occur particularly strongly in psychology, and that's probably why it started off in psychology. But psychology has also done the most to kind of quantify this problem within its own area. And even though other subjects have not done as much kind of internal soul-searching stuff as we have in psychology, the same kinds of problems clearly are there, and there are kind of glimmers of the same problems, even if someone hasn't gone out and tried to replicate lots of experiments. The levels of statistical power, the amount of openness and transparency, the general some of the statistical errors and so on can be found across lots of different areas. And so the idea is that if someone was theoretically to go along and try and replicate those studies, they might find something quite similar to what happens in psychology.
Okay. Another question? Thank you for the great lecture. Do you think that journals that use public peer review practices, such as F1000, are pushing conventional journals in the same direction?
It's a great question as well. The Faculty of 1000 journal, for anyone who doesn't know, it's this. So I'm not 100% familiar with it, but I think the idea is that you submit your almost like a preprint of your article, and it automatically gets put online. And then the peer reviewers review it in public, so you can see for any given article, you can see what the peer reviewers are saying, and then they'll say, by this particular date, the authors are going to send in their next version of their article, and it gets published online too, and then the peer reviews get published online, and then at a certain point, there's a final version of the article published. So the whole process of peer review, which often normally in 99% of journals happens behind closed doors and no one ever sees it. It's made transparent in the case of this Faculty of 1000 journal. I think it's a great idea. I wish more people were trying out variations of that kind of thing. I know that some quite prestigious journals are now changing to do things like this. So, for instance, the journal, do you know the journal eLife? It's a relatively new journal. It was set up as a kind of a more open alternative to Nature and Science for people who publish Nature and Science and Cell, I suppose, for people who publish biological research. And eLife publishes the peer reviews and the previous versions of the articles alongside its articles. So it doesn't do the thing that Faculty of 1000 does, where you can watch the whole process happening. It does publish a paper, but down the side of the paper, you can find what was originally submitted and what the peer reviewers originally said. And I think that is really important as well, because there is a debate about whether peer review being anonymous is a bad thing. It allows people to trash each other's articles on the one hand, but it also allows people to say things that they might be too scared to say because of, if you're saying them about a professor and you're just a PhD student or whatever, it allows, the anonymity allows you to make those comments. So there's kind of, an interesting thing there about whether it should be anonymous, but whether or not it should be anonymous, publishing the reviews online seems like a great idea to me.
Yeah, peer review itself is a whole theme for discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually. Yeah, I think, do you have more questions, Rafael? Yeah, so Rodolfo Fagundes Costa. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Ritchie. Do you think that the peer review analysis will maintain itself, or it will go into a path where reviewers are contracted and remunerated by journals?
It is quite funny that you mentioned the peer review process to anyone who isn't a scientist, and they say, "Oh, how much do you get paid for peer review?" And you go, "Oh, we do it for free." And they go, "What? What?" It's like a kind of a crazy situation that we've got ourselves into. I think what one of the possibilities that I describe in the book, and it's just a kind of here's a fantasy possibility for how science could be, and it comes from a paper that Brian Nosek from the Center for Open Science wrote a few years ago. One possibility for changing it is that in order to take the decision to publish results out of the hands of journal editors and make sure that every result gets published, no matter what it looks like, all articles would be put online as a preprint, and then there would be a reviewing service that reviews each paper. So you would have like a central service that contracts reviewers out to review papers, and then the paper would get 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 or 5 out of 10. You need to revise this paper, and then you could then the journals would then act as kind of almost like curation engines, right? They would be like the editor would be saying, I think these are the most important articles that are published in the last little while. That's an alternative way of looking at it. But in that model, yeah, you would probably not be asking the reviewers to do all the work for free like they currently do. And I think from your question, it sounds like you're thinking along similar lines to that. But yeah, I think it is a very bizarre situation that all this unpaid labor goes into peer reviewing articles, and you can see why that leads to problems as well, because the peer reviewers are themselves scientists who are really busy and are being pushed to publish all their own stuff and write their own grant applications and do all their own teaching and all the other stuff that scientists have to do, and so you can see how things slip through the net.
Yes, but can I comment something?
Yeah,
sure.
This is just the final point of a whole chain. Because yes, if we have more time to peer review with quality, probably we will have less papers published, what is not necessarily bad. As you say in your book, every 9 years approximately, right, we will double the number of published papers. So it's a lot of bibliography to read. So first, we probably should haven't published so much as we are doing now, and we will have more time to peer review, and not necessarily, I guess it should be paid for, because we are a whole community. We are community. So there is no problem in correcting or reviewing the others' articles and not being paid, because we are a community. It's like all correcting the others, and it's good for you too, because we are learning too. So
it's you could argue that it's part of the job and it's part of what you're getting your salary for. But I do think that most things that we want done well, we do give some reward for it. And there are some initiatives to try and reward peer reviewing a little bit more. So there are these I can't remember what the website's called, but there's a website where you can put in which journals you've peer reviewed for, and it gives you a kind of a reward score for that. So things like that I think are very positive. Another weird thing that I didn't mention that I think should be considered in this case is, isn't it weird? Isn't it a very strange thing that articles that get published with open data, which is obviously a great thing, that's often not the case. The data are not made open during the peer review process. So at the point that the paper is being looked at in probably in more detail than it ever will be by anyone else, the peer reviewers are looking at it, the data are still not shared. And then when the paper eventually gets published, at that point the data gets shared. There's a really weird situation where in most cases the peer reviewers are not looking at the original data. And of course, as you're saying, you would need a lot more time. If you were given the original data and you were asked, can you run these analyses again? You would need extra time, you would need extra expertise, and so on. But the question is it worth it? Like maybe it's worth it to get the science right. So I just find that a really weird situation that and again, I think if you just stopped someone randomly in the street and said, "Do you think that peer reviewers should have access to the data?" They would say, "Yeah, of course," but they often don't.
Yes.
Yeah, and the only thing that we get being a good reviewer is to get more work to do.
Yeah, I agree.
With time and with lots of comments and everything, so they will call you again to do it.
Agreed. Yeah,
that's a problem too. Okay, any more questions? So, José Newton Grigueto Filho, question: do you have some examples or at least comments on non-experiment science, such as some branches of social sciences?
Yeah, I mean, I myself, the vast majority of my research is in what we call non-experimental social science. That is generally observational studies, and I think it has its own set of problems. I think the particular type of questionable research practice that happens most often in that type of research is the kind of data dredging problem, where you have all these big data sets that people have collected. So, for instance, I mean. Nutrition science is one real clear example of this, where there are all these big data sets of people who have reported what they've eaten, their food intake on food frequency questionnaires, and then there's all health outcomes that they've recorded as well, and you can just dig into those data sets, which are often on loads and loads of people with loads and loads of data. You can just dig into them and find any old thing and publish it. And that's what I think a lot of nutrition research. It's why a lot of nutrition research doesn't get replicated, and it also allows scientists to kind of go out into the press and say, "Look, I found this unexpected thing correlates with eating eggs correlates with heart disease, or drinking milk or red wine, and it does and it doesn't." And these morass of contradictory findings you get in the nutrition research literature. I think you do get that same problem in some areas of non-experimental kind of observational psychology research, like I work in, educational research, aging research, where you're following up people over time, but you're not necessarily doing an experiment on them, but you're tracking them over time. And I think a way out of that is the pre-registration idea. So whereas you can't, because the data already exist, you can't pre-register your collection of those data, but you can pre-register your analysis. You can write down what you're planning to do, put it somewhere public, and then try your best to stick to it when you're writing your study. And even if you make some changes, it's fine to make some changes and say, "Look, I thought of this afterwards," and write that down. But that moves away from the norm, which is just digging around and just finding any old thing, or convincing yourself, this hypothesizing after the results are known harking thing, where you look at the data and kind of think, I see that's correlated with that. So I think probably, and by that point, you've already corrupted your fresh blank slate palette, your blank slate of because you've already looked at how the data correlate together. So I think there are ways of making the approach to non-experimental research more rigorous. I've written a paper with the lead author is Sarah Weston. That's Sarah S-A-R-A Weston, on pre-registering non-experimental studies, which you can look up.
Well, on that topic, one problem is that scientists would probably tend to be honest and open if they were left to their own devices. But what happens in practice is bureaucracies force the scientists to do other things. So the some of your suggestions, like the registering and all those, would require scientists to slow down while the bureaucracy, the administration, academia is wanting them to speed up. And so have you considered how to balance the needs of the science versus the pressures put on them by financial supporters? You know, like the Brazilian government, for example, is a little bit problematic, but it's the same thing in the United States right now with funding and everything else. You have to be a super producer to get the best funding. And that makes you review less, slow down less, and be less inclined to register your studies as your suggestions imply that we should be doing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's a very common thing where when I discuss this with people, they say, "Well, I can't do this. I don't have time to do this. I don't have my students need to be writing papers, otherwise they won't get a job. My next grant won't come in if I've been spending all my time registering research. It adds to the bureaucracy. It adds to the pre-registering result is an extra stage in the research process that I don't necessarily want to do. And I think the way that we change that is that we try to lobby the funders. We try and lobby the people who are responsible for carrying out the research. And I think to some extent we've been successful. So I think now, for instance, in the UK, the funders, so we have this, we used to have all these different research councils for different subjects, and they all just got subsumed under this one thing called UK Research and Innovation, the UKRI. And UKRI now, when you write a grant request, they now ask you to write a paragraph on how you will make your findings more replicable and transparent and open and all that. So that's now part of the process. Now, that could just be a box ticking exercise. One would hope that it actually has some effect, and we would be able to study that at some point, I'm sure. Right. But funders don't want to be the next victim to a fraudulent result or the next victim to a non-replicated result or whatever. They have the same kind of desires as the rest of us do. As you say, like in a perfect world, they would want to be funding research that's important and replicable and so on. So it's this kind of self-perpetuating system that we've got into where, the people who are the most productive are maybe the ones that are cutting corners, and they're also the ones that have got the most money, so they can go on to fund the next generation of scientists and so on. So we need to break the cycle. And I think, as I said, to some degree, just talking about this stuff and maybe slightly shaming people for doing that kind of thing is part of it. But there's a lot of different stuff. It's not just one answer to this. There's a lot of different things that have to be done. The top-down changes, the bottom-up changes, making it one thing. Again, I mentioned him earlier. Brian Nosek wrote quite a good blog post from the Center for Open Science. And one thing is just making it easier for people. So, that big problem with I can't do this because it takes up so much time can be made easier by certain online tools, templates, ways of making your pre-registration visible and so on, and just helping people do that in an easy way. I think is maybe not half the battle, but is a lot of the battle to convincing them. Because if it's such a hassle, then why would you do it? I certainly find myself now that I'm into pre-registering stuff and all that, I do think, oh God, I don't even want to start another project because I have to do it. But another way of phrasing that is, oh, I don't want to have another project because I have to do it right. And that's obviously this is what we should be thinking. We should be thinking we should only do something if we can put enough effort into it to make it right. But yeah, I totally agree with you that it's an extremely tangled problem, and it's very difficult to know where to begin. But I think trying all these initiatives is probably the best way of chipping away at the problem.
Right.
Okay. And when you have this pre-registration linked to the journal, and I guarantee that your work will be published if it's okay, that's a great deal.
Yeah, I think
you already have.
Yeah, you can't use it in every case if the data already exist and so on. Although I think some journals are allowing you to do that. But yeah, I think the registered report format is one of the ways that we will save the peer-reviewed literature from a lot of these problems. I think it's a fantastic idea. And you know, there's another that the same journal where this was pioneered, which is the journal Cortex, which is a neuroscience journal, has also now implemented a sort of equal and opposite type of report, which is called an exploratory report, where you say, before you touch any of the data, you just say, hands up, I don't have any particular hypotheses here. I'm just going to dig into this data and see what's interesting. And that's fine too, and that shouldn't be stigmatized, and that's not wrong. But it's just, if you admit, if you're saying beforehand you're totally straight up about it, then go for it, you know. And so that journal has been really forward thinking in how to change science.
One minor detail about that exploratory kind of work is that you have to know that your probabilities change. You know, statistically, you have to know how to analyze exploratory and report the probabilities that are different than they would be if you predicted them.
Yeah, that's
because,
true. Yeah.
You know, you search through 1,000 possibilities and you get a couple correlations. You can't just report those as though they were real. You need to really know how to statistically adjust for exploration rather than prediction. But
agreed.
So that has to be built into the process.
Yeah. Some people would say that you shouldn't even be using, p-values at all when you're exploring data and all. That's sure. The kind of the more extreme angle on it. And you know, I think you're absolutely right that the way that you approach statistics needs to be quite different in those cases.
Okay. So can we make more? We have a few more questions, Stuart. Can we go on?
There was a p-value question. Oh, yes.
All right. Okay. So Anderson, Martin Andrade, do you think that discussing results with p-values above 0.05 is always a problem? For example, we can have a result of 0.06 along with other data that go in the same direction.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I wasn't arguing that reporting those results is problematic. But what I was arguing was that if you agree to play the game where less than 0.05 is statistically significant, right? And we do either explicitly or implicitly all agree that that is the game that we're playing when we use p-values and we report them in that way. And once you've agreed to play that game, you can't then say, well, we got a result that was p equals 0.06, and we think that's probably, you know, that probably is significant anyway. That you know, it's trending towards significance. So let's just talk about it as if it was significant. I think you can't have it both ways. Either you decide that that's your cutoff and that things below it are significant, or you don't. Because if you don't, and you just end up just talking about any result that's you know, you've said that your alpha level is p equals 0.05, and you start talking about p equals 0.06, p equals 0.08 as statistically significant, then really anything goes. You've lost the great function of having an alpha criterion, which is basically to tie your hands a little bit and make you not push things in ways which we know will likely be biased in favor of your hypothesis, right? We all know we're all human. We'll all interpret results in ways that make it more likely to support our particular hypothesis. So I think we should all be 100% open and transparent with what results we find. But if you're going to set yourself a little rule, like you do when you set yourself the p equals 0.05 criterion, then you should follow it.
On that topic, I'd like to make a quick comment.
Sure.
And that is that often we're confused by the statistical program that we use, whatever, and we don't realize that many tests are automatically two-tailed when our hypothesis is one-tailed. So a p of 0.06, if we actually have a one-tailed hypothesis and the computer program reported a two-tailed result, our probability is really half that. Yeah. And so that just adds to the confusion of the issue. And then
kind of lost you there.
Yes, we lost Jim.
Oh, Jim, are you there?
Experimental error.
Oh, hello. Sorry, can you say that last bit again? We just lost you slightly.
Sure. So people start using p-value when it's less than 0.05 as an indicator of the strength of the relationship. So a p-value of 0.01 is worse than 0.001, when actually those two values are probably just experimental differences. The difference between the two, the important factors, would be the effect size, not the p-value.
Totally agree. And you know, it's only in cases, I think people are confused because in cases where everything else is held equal, then the p-value and the effect size will track each other. But that's not the case in many different experiments. You're going to have different variables with different standard deviations, and you're going to have different samples. You can have different sample sizes and so on. And so the whole thing about all else held equal disappears. But people forget that, and so they confuse the p-value and the effect size. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Next question, Joanna. You cited fraud, data manipulation, inappropriate use of statistical results. What is the relationship of these points with the ethical personality of the human being?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a fascinating question because the reason that I find stories of scientific fraud to be so interesting is because of, you know, partly what it reveals about science in general, but also what it reveals about those individuals, right? About the sorts of persons that the sorts of people that they are. And, you know, I tell the story in the book about Paolo Macchiarini, who is a surgeon, an Italian surgeon who did all these operations. It's a long story, but he did all these operations which ended up killing a lot of the patients. And then he wrote fraudulent scientific papers that reported that actually everything was completely fine with the patients and the operations were doing well. The operations had done very well. He, it turned out, in his private life, was also a kind of a con man fraudster. He there's an article in Vanity Fair about how he was dating this NBC News producer who he took her to Venice and he told her that they're getting married and that by the way, that he was the Pope's personal doctor and that the Pope was going to officiate their wedding and that the Obamas were coming and that Elton John was going to do the music at their wedding and all this stuff. Turned out he was married the whole time to someone else and he had kids. And they phoned up, the Vanity Fair phoned up the Vatican and said, "Have you ever heard of this guy?" And they said, "No, we've never heard of this guy." So it was all just a kind of a con man fraud type situation. And so was his science, right? So his personality, his ethics and so on were clearly all wrapped up there. So that's quite an extreme case. But I think in many other cases, you do see this kind of, lack of care and attention to detail. You see the kind of callousness that you often see with people who are sort of con artists and so on. But in other cases where people have committed fraud, it's not actually that clear that it's that it's just their unethical personality coming out. In some cases, you do feel like people have just kind of misunderstood what they're supposed to be doing, or they feel such weird pressure from the scientific system that they just find themselves cutting corners and doing things which slip into fraud, and they don't even quite realize how bad it can be. So, for instance, another story I tell in the book is Brian Wansink, who used to be at Cornell University, who was, his university fired him because of data, not fabrication, but data manipulation, or falsification, I think was the word they used. So technically it was fraud. But from looking at it and from watching his YouTube videos that he made and all this sort of stuff, I don't get the impression that he was like a really devious person. I get the impression that he just didn't really get it. Like he just didn't really understand what the point of doing science really was. And he just thought it was kind of a thing for show. And he ended up kind of blundering into doing all these really terrible experiments and ending up technically, according to the definition, committing fraud, even though I don't think he actually set out to make up any results. So there's a whole spectrum of people along this line. And by the way, I think the spectrum of outright making up data fraud leads all the way into p hacking. And I think there are people who do p hacking and they just don't realize what they're doing. But there are people who do p hacking and questionable research practices who do know that it's bad, and yet they do it anyway. And I think you could argue at least that is committing fraud to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fascinating. So I think we have a last question from the chat.
Sure.
From Andrea Pradial. From a psychological point of view, how do you think that governed with radical opinions, such as in U.S. and Brazil, may lead scientists to be dishonest and try to publish research supporting radical opinions.
Well, I think that's been illustrated really nicely by the, again, I mentioned it earlier, the hydroxychloroquine story, where not necessarily the researchers, well, we'll come back to the research in the US, the ones I already mentioned, but the researchers in France who had originally published the hydroxychloroquine stuff, that was their original study. So Didier Raoult and a couple of other people at, I can't remember which university in France, but they published the pro hydroxychloroquine results, and they were clearly being very strongly encouraged to do so by politicians and by those politicians' supporters from lots of different countries, who had come out like Donald Trump did, and said hydroxychloroquine is the new wonder drug for the future, or whatever he came out with, possibly a game changer, I think is what he said on Twitter. So they were clearly pushed in the direction of publishing that stuff, and they ended up, publishing it in journals where they were on the editorial board, and the whole process was extremely non-transparent. That's one side of it. But I think the other side of it, remember I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, I mentioned the Harvard study that showed that hydroxychloroquine was bad, and actually, they claimed that it actually increased the death rate. And of course, it turned out that those data were dodgy as well, and so on. Is it too much of a? Does it go too far for me to suggest that maybe they were less willing to check because they knew that their data would upset Donald Trump, right? Their data would show that Donald Trump was wrong. It would upset people who like Donald Trump. It would upset Donald Trump, and so they needed to publish it. And I think that's sounds like a plausible, at least partial explanation of what happened there, is that they published it because it was kind of too good to check. Because it was like, wow, not only does hydroxychloroquine not work, it actually is damaging, and this will really get Donald Trump, make him look like an idiot. And so it does sort of seem to me that the politicization of research in the way that you're describing there works both ways. So not only does it encourage bad researchers to publish stuff that supports the government position, but it seems also in other cases to support to push bad researchers who should know better to publish stuff that goes against the government and that's also of low quality. So I think just this politicization that we've seen, particularly around COVID-19, but also in other areas, does nobody any good on either side of the argument.
Okay, thank you. So, Elena, you'd like to talk a little bit about scientific communication?
Yes. I would like to ask, what is your opinion, Stuart, about it? Because sometimes I feel that we misunderstood what is our role in scientific communication is like. We should, like I wrote to you, sometimes I feel like we should be like preachers, telling people that the science is important, and like we need to justify what we are doing and always need to have a practical result. Like, I studied this because of that in your daily life. But that's not the way we work. That's not exactly what we are interested. There is the basic science. So I would like to hear from you some comments.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and certainly our universities push us to. I don't know what the situation is like in Brazil, but certainly here in the UK, our universities are very strongly pushing us to communicate results to the world and have impact in some way in the world. Impact is the big word that gets discussed all the time about what you're doing for the outside world, and I think in some cases that can turn people into. You use the word preacher, but I think it can turn people into salespeople, right? They're wanting to sell their result to the world, and so it encourages them to maybe just downplay the downsides of their, even if there is something there is a real result that's reliable and so on. It can encourage them to kind of downplay the any problems or anything like that. And I think again, to bring up COVID-19, the thing that we're seeing, is the thing that we saw at the start of the epidemic was in psychology, for instance, we had loads of researchers jumping out to say psychology is the key to this. Psychology will cure this because we need to change people's behaviors, whether it's to do with washing our hands or wearing masks or social distancing. It's all about psychology. And here's all the psychology literature that will tell us how to solve the COVID problem. And I think the psychology literature that they presented had all these problems in it, had all these problems of reproducibility, generalizability, all the problems that we've been talking about. And they were they glided over these problems in order to make themselves feel like they were making a difference, right? That they were doing something worthwhile, that they were helping out. And I think we all want to do that. Probably the majority of people who get into science want to do it because they want to find something out that's real. They want to help people. They want to discover true facts. So, and that wanting to help people motive was clearly a big part of this. And when, me and a few colleagues kind of pointed out to them, well, there are some problems with the literature here, and maybe we shouldn't be too, pushing this out to politicians and saying this is what we should definitely do because, a lot of the evidence is not that strong. They kind of pushed back and they said, like, oh, well, you're trying to undermine science and all this kind of stuff. And that's absolutely not my intention, as you know. And so, I think it's another perverse incentive to try and push us to be salespersons for our results. And that's not how science should be. I mean, defending your result in a rational way against criticism is totally fine, and that's part of the whole debate that we have in peer review. You have your response to the reviewers and all that. That's great, but going out there into the world with press releases and books and whatever else, and not, again, it kind of all comes down to the common denominator of being open and transparent, right? Not being open about the problems, not being transparent about how those data appeared in the first place. Can get us into all sorts of problems. And so I think we saw that during COVID-19, but you also see it in basically every area where scientists are going out there and advocating for their research.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, okay, thank you again, Dr. Ritchie. So you're getting to the end of our conversation. It was a really wonderful conversation. I think many people got aware of lots of problems we have in science, but also some new ideas of what to do. Many people in the chat commented about this pre-registration thing, that they loved it, or it's really a good idea to think through. And this is what we were aiming for our graduate program, that we have this kind of conversations. Everybody is more aware of things that can happen, and a very healthy discussion. And really, we enjoyed very much that you got time to share your thoughts with us. And I read in a recent publishing that you make in a I think it was a blog or something about heroes in COVID or heroes in science. And actually, you were my hero. But I hope you can equilibrate all these fancy places, your book and everything. And many people are asking for your presentation because they want to see the people that you mentioned and the studies that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that many of those who are going to look for your book. And as Elena said, I really recommend the book. It's very interesting, many examples, and also optimistical thoughts about what we should do to do better, and that's important too. Great. So thank you very much again.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who attended and everyone who sent in questions, because they were great questions. So I had a really great time talking to you guys. So thank you so much.
Okay, yes, and thank you again for.
If anyone finds error in the book, he's paying back.
I have a system where if you find a mistake in the book that's an objective mistake, I'm happy to pay you for it. So it's on the website. If you go to sciencefictions.org, you can find out about that.
Okay, and
thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Elena, for the initiative. Thank you, Jim, for being here with the conversation. And Rafael, which is in the background, but doing all this function. And thank you for all the audience. And bye-bye. Have a nice week.
Great. You too. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
How do you get out of this thing?